Now, at the time, you had the Washington Post reporter of Watergate fame, Bob Woodward, dump on President Ford for pardoning Nixon. The Kennedys dump on President Ford. What was the deal behind the scenes? And of course, Ford says, there was no deal. I resent that. There was no deal. I did that for this country, and I'm taking the bullet for it. That was the kind of courage President Ford had. And he was very stung by people who questioned his motives, that there was a deal or that he was not being patriotic. Absolutely. In fact, when Al Haig came up to him and even drafted a memo that had the wording of a deal, President Ford looked at him and said, there's not going to be a deal, Al. You can take your little memo back to your office and throw it away. He was indignant because Haig was bringing back the old politics, of backroom deals and the mistrust of the presidency. And 1 month before, remember, Ford had said, our long national nightmare is over, and it's only over if I'm good as my word and I can get people to trust me personally and begin, once again, this desperate climb back so the American people respect the institution of the presidency. Because if we don't have that, our country might as well just kiss it goodbye. So the Nixon pardon, as controversial as it was, showed tremendous personal courage on his part. His popularity plummeted, but he just worked on the problems that he saw that the country had. And of course, in 2001, he was awarded a Profile and Courage Award by, where else? The Kennedy Library and Museum Foundation in Boston, Massachusetts, in which Edward Kennedy, Senator Edward Kennedy, stood up with President Ford and he said, Mr. President, I was wrong. In 1974, I was wrong about you. You did the right thing for our country. And Bob Woodward later recanted. I heard Bob Woodward in Ann Arbor a year and a half ago tell his personal journey, how many years it took him to see that President Ford did the right thing. The journalist Richard Reeves recanted. You go through a whole list of who's who of people who, with time, the passage of 3 decades, saw that it was important that Ford did exactly what he did and helped the country heal and recover. And it started with pardoning Nixon. And then, of course, very controversial decision. Oh, I come from a military family. My dad and my mom hated President Ford for this, but pardoned the draft evaders. Granted leniencies, they could come back to this country at the time. Another very controversial decision. When Ford went to Chicago to announce that, talk about courage. You'd think he would announce that to a liberal group or at a press conference with liberal journalists. He went to the Veterans of Foreign Wars in Chicago, to their national convention to do this. And he said, he quipped beforehand to his handlers, he said, I think this is one speech I'll be giving where I won't be interrupted by applause. He knew darn good and well that this would be controversial. He had the guts to do it. He knew what the ancients like Plutarch and Thucydides and Herodotus and Caesar in his commentaries knew. He knew that leaders, good leaders, have the capacity to make tough decisions. And then to be able to stand by that decision, stay the course, no matter what the flack all around is. President Ford used to say, just as many other presidents have said, who fought in World War II, if he's getting flack all around him, and it's coming from every direction after he made a decision, he's getting criticized from every direction, well, he probably made a good decision because everybody was equally unhappy. So, he could put these things in balance. He had an equanimity. He had a trust in his own instincts. He had a comfort in his own skin. And it worked. It served him well. He's a very courageous man. His character also, besides being shown in his sense of public service and all those positions where he gave of himself to his country and in his courage and his ability to stay the course, I mentioned to you before this fourth quality, trust. When I was talking to him, it was the last interview I had with him before he died. He died in, of course, December, but this was a summer, a year and a half before. And as I say, the last series of interviews that anybody had, I was privileged to have with him. And without any hesitation, he said the most important quality that a leader needs to have is trust. So that's again, part of that core that people need to have. He also, I mean, for those of us who've been parents and know the frustrations and the joys of parenting, but we all know who've been parents that parenting is the hardest job in the world. Would everybody agree with that?
Yeah.
There's nothing harder. And the more kids you have, the more interesting it gets. But as a child, Jerry had a raging temper. And his mother, Dorothy, used to work with him and say, we're going to get control. You're going to have that temper all your life, but you're going to have to learn to control it. And so she made him read and reread and reread and reread Rudyard Kipling's poem, If, which begins, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. And so Ford said in later life that that poem would often, and his mother's loving discipline and firmness with him, often came to mind when he was having troubles with his control. He said, I'd like to find a quotation here about his raging temper even as an adult. One of the ways he would calm himself is he'd puff on that pipe. It's very sort of a methodical way of slowing everything down, just letting everybody lose their head around him. He's going to stay calm and control the situation. He's going to, in other words, lead. But he confessed that he often inside lost his temper, but he learned not to show it. So he really is a model, I think, for all of us. And we all have our anger and our frustration, but he knew that once he gave voice to his anger, that changes the chemistry in a room. It changes the freedom of people to maneuver and make the right decision, because all of a sudden they're thrown back on the defense. He had that real sense that Aristotle talked about anger. Ford wasn't against anger, but he adopted Aristotle's position. You have to know when it's appropriate to be angry, to what degree, at whom, how angry to get, and so forth. You have to, and that's through experience. And Ford learned self-control, especially over his anger, in a way that really became a model for us. Now, the fourth quality great statesmen have, according to the ancients, you'll recall I said at the beginning, is social skills. President Ford had these social skills in spades. He knew how to connect to every man. If you look at the terms that were used to describe him, down to earth, unpretentious, approachable, likable, an ordinary guy. These were the words that you would hear about him. Now, he wasn't any man's tool. What you saw was what you got. He was very much himself, but it just that what he was very comfortable to be around. I used to marvel when I was with him, and I'd had the privilege of interviewing him also in the 90s. So when I did the last series of interviews in 2005, I had a little bit of a history with him. And I used to marvel. I'm sitting with the man who was the most powerful man in the world for 895 days. And yet he makes me feel so much at home. There wasn't an ounce of lording it over me, looking down on me, a mere citizen, a peon. He was not that way. He was a perfectly gracious gentleman. Wonderful, lovely man. What a model for a president. He had the ability not only to make people like him and want to talk to him, but to attract first-rate talent around him. Now, people forget that Alan Greenspan, Henry Kissinger were part of his team. This is a little bit more controversial, but Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney were part of his team too. He did recognize talent. Those individuals have become very controversial, but this was 30 years earlier, and their talent as young men was recognized. And wonderful cabinet officers, people like Carla Hills. I just was with Carla Hills in Washington at a Ford event last week, and she was receiving the Ford Prize. And Carla Hills gave a beautiful speech on behalf of all the surviving members of the Ford administration about what it meant to work in the Ford administration.